Being live streamed. All right, gang. This meeting is being recorded. Got it. Welcome one and welcome all to tonight's webinar. It has begun. My name's Christian. I'll be your host for the evening. Tonight, we're thrilled to have Jeremy Kuzmarov with us, esteemed author, editor, political analyst, an overall brilliant mind and a great guy. So we'll speak to him momentarily. Just to give you a little bit about what this group is, it's called the War Industry Resistors Network, or WIRN, W-I-R-N. It's a loose grouping of over 40 organizations now, and these organizations work together to counter the business of war and militarism in general. The network's links will be posted in the chat during this evening's webinar. The network's main focus at this stage is education, and it does that through holding webinars like the one here this evening. These webinars over the past year and beyond have covered many aspects of the war industry, from lobbyists and their interaction with US Congress to how think tanks produce information justifying war and broad military deployments, to how war industry technology is used on the borders of the United States and inside the United States, and how the war industry sells to some of the worst regimes on earth. So past webinar presenters have included academics, researchers, labor organizers, military veterans, journalists, longtime peace activists, celebrated authors, and more. As there are war corporations all over the US, so too there are people who oppose these corporations and oppose the business. So it's important to note that the executives at these corporations could steer their businesses in any direction, but they choose to stay in the business of war. And as long as they are, Warren will be around to point that out and to educate the public to the best we can. So you can find the War Industry Resistors Network on Facebook, and you can always reach out via email. That's WIRN@veteransforpeace.org. We'll put that in the chat as well. Tonight, Brian Garvey is doing the tech work, and he will, so he's on the ball on that. Mr. Garvey is Assistant Director over at Mass Peace Action, MAPA, and he organizes as part of the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign and a number of other MAPA working groups. He writes regularly for Mass Peace Action's website, and he's in their newsletter as well, and he possesses a really, truly comprehensive understanding of U.S. history and U.S. foreign policy, so it's a pleasure to have him on board as well. And now here is Mr. Ken Jones, with some more information about future WIRN events.
Thank you, Christian, and hello, everyone. I just want to make a reminder to everyone that we've been doing these webinars for almost 3 years now. This is our 31st webinar, and you can find the recordings of all these other webinars that Christian was just talking about. You can find them on our website. I just posted the link to our website in the chat. And I want to tell you about our upcoming webinars. We've got a few scheduled in advance already. And our next webinar is going to be July 18th, and Brian posted a note in the chat about that with a registration link. And that's going to be Bruce Gagnon to talk about NATO and its aggressive destabilizing role in Europe and in the Asia Pacific and in the Arctic as well. So that's July 18th. That'll be our next one. In August 15th, our focus is going to be, once again, we did this once before a year or two ago, on the border industrial complex down in the Arizona-Mexican area. And our presenters will be Todd Miller, who's been with us before, and Melissa Del Bosque, and they are the publishers of the Border Chronicle, which I can't recommend highly enough. It's a subscription newsletter that you get twice a week about what's going on at the border. And on September 17th, the following month, we'll have Bill Hartung discussing how war corporations are making profits in Gaza and everywhere else. You may know Bill. We've had him before, and he's an expert on where the money goes and where the contracts are and who the profiteers are making money off all this. And then in October, we're going to have David Swanson, who's also been with us before. This time he's going to be reporting back. They have an annual conference, and he's going to be reporting back about that annual conference, the topic of which is U.S. military bases, the base empire around the world. So we're set to go through October, and I hope you'll stick with us each month as we keep our eyes on the U.S. war industry. Thanks for being here, and let's get on with it.
Thank you, Ken. You're the man. Tonight, our esteemed speaker is Jeremy Kuzmarov. Jeremy is the managing editor of CovertAction online magazine. He has taught at numerous universities and colleges, primarily in the field of U.S. history and international relations. His extensive research focuses on covert aspects of U.S. foreign policy, the war on drugs, U.S. air wars and the human cost, the expanse of U.S. military bases around the world, and as well as the manipulation of the U.S. public into going along with some of these wars. So this research is incredibly valuable to anyone who's looking to establish peace in our lifetime. Jeremy's full bio is available on Mass Peace Action's website. So please check it out there. Tonight's format, we're going to do question and answer. I'll ask the question, Jeremy will answer. We'll go back and forth for a little bit. Around a half hour, we are going to take a quick break for an action, 5 minutes around that time. And then we'll do a few more questions and then open it up for audience questions at around 45-minute mark. We're going to keep tonight's event to a tight hour, so I will end it at the hour. And yeah, we look forward to your questions as well. So giddy up. All right, Jeremy, thank you for being here. This is a real treat for us. Can you briefly lay out the premise of your new book?
Sure. Well, and thanks so much for having me. And yeah, it's a wonderful program that you guys put together, and you get really a great education from attending these webinars, which is so vital, yeah, in building a peace and progressive movement in the country. This book, well, yeah, I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I visited, well, in 2010, when I first moved to this region, I gave a talk at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, and it was about the war on drugs, and I only knew a little bit about it, but people in the audience were telling me about MENA and all the shady thing that went on there, and I knew only a little bit about it. So that, triggered my interest, and ended up, researching this topic in depth. So, well, I mean, because the first part of the book looks at the background of Clinton, and I think, as I was pointing out before, when we were discussing this just before the webinar started, a lot of people really don't know that much about Clinton's very shady background, because the national media did not cover this story very well at all. So the first part of the book looks at, who Clinton really is, how he rose to power. Well, and firstly, I do, show he had a connection with the Central Intelligence Agency going back to his time as a student at Oxford, and it was admitted by Cord Meyer Jr. That he had recruited Clinton, because Clinton's roommate at Oxford was Strobe Talbot, who became Deputy Secretary of State. And Strobe Talbot came from a wealthy Ohio family. His uncle had been Secretary of the Air Force, who did all kinds of favors for the CIA, and believed his whole family was connected with the CIA. And he became the Russian editor for Time magazine, which has a known, tied to the loose empire. And the reason, well, Clinton was recruited with Talbot to go on a trip to Russia to smuggle the diary of Nikita Khrushchev, which was valuable for U.S. purposes of the Cold War. And then, yeah, anyway, since I'll give just a brief overview, and you can, of course, hopefully you'll get the book and read, all the details.
Absolutely.
But when he became governor of Arkansas, he basically turned his state into a CIA proprietary. And MENA was where they ran these armed and drug smuggling operation to the Nicaraguan Contras. Like, a lot of people don't realize how central Arkansas and Clinton were to the whole Iran-Contra scandal. And actually, it was brought up at the Iran-Contra hearing, but that part was classified. But a lot has come out about it, and some of the research I did was at the archives of the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. there was a group of Arkansas students in the 80s, and Clinton was the governor, who set up a committee of concerned Arkansas students about what was going on and some of the corruption. And they really looked into it, and they got a lot of good information on this, and they deposited their archive, their records at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. So it is open to researchers, but of course, not a lot of people have visited there if you don't live in the region, and probably few researchers have even looked at it. So, but it's quite damning as far as Clinton's role in overseeing these covert military operations associated with the Iran-Contra. And one thing he did was, he set up this development agency that was packaged as, promoting economic development for the state of Arkansas. But actually, he was giving loans to companies for military industry, exactly what you guys are focused on. So it was actually, he was that agency was financing military industry and military startups in the state of Arkansas, some run by his cronies that were producing the arms to give to the Contras. And also in those records at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, is a report that detail how the CIA actually shook down local gun dealers and stole their guns and drove them out of business. And those are the arm they were smuggling to the Contras. So
Unbelievable.
people don't, I think most people aren't aware that all that went on. Because, in 84, Congress cut off aid to the Contras because they were mining the Nicaraguan harbors, and they were considered a terrorist organization. So that's when the CIA and elements in the Reagan administration resorted to illegal ways of continuing to arm them, and Clinton was kind of their ace in the hole. And allegedly, he struck a deal, and that he had these powerful people then who assisted him to become president. And I mean, a lot of the book just looks at his presidency and where he continued, to support covert military operations.
Well, let me ask you about that.
Okay.
Let me pop in and just ask you sort of how was Clinton's presidency a turning point in modern U.S. history, if at all, if you would describe it that way?
Well, I do, because and Clinton is not thought of as a warmonger. Other presidents are, like George W. Bush or Lyndon Johnson. Clinton, and some liberals may even still have a soft spot for Clinton, although I think he's unpopular among younger generations. But yeah, I see it as a major turning point, because with the end of the Cold War, you actually had momentum for a transformation of U.S. foreign policy. You had even Robert McNamara, the Vietnam War hawk, uh, who had kind of mellowed in older age, and he testified before Congress in 1991. He said, "Look, the Cold War is over. We defeated our enemy. Now is the time for a peace dividend. Now is the time to cut back the military budget and actually invest in the American people in healthcare." And he said exactly this: healthcare, education, the stuff we would want in our group here. And this is Robert McNamara saying it, and there are others like him in the establishment. But then along comes Clinton, and he invents new pretexts for military intervention. And he kind of, I mean, he didn't pioneer it, but he promoted this idea that in the post-Cold War era, the U.S. has to be involved in, humanitarian interventions. And he kind of got, because he packaged like himself as this icon of, this embodiment of the 60s movements and their ethos, that he was this, and there were, he had claimed to be in the anti-war movement, although it's believed he was actually an FBI informant in the anti-war movement. But he presented himself as, kind of like a hippie, into the sexual revolution, and he was on Arsenio Hall, playing jazz. And even Jan Wenner, the head of Rolling Stone, kind of bought into it, and he wrote an editorial saying, "Oh, vote for Clinton. Finally, somebody of our generation has come in." And I think his magic for the establishment was to get that generation on board with humanitarian intervention by playing up the genocide, human right. He played off this human rights consciousness that had developed out of the Vietnam War, but used it. Oh, the Serbs are committing genocide in Rwanda, and we've got to go in and stop these genocide. And this will actually be a good war. Vietnam was a bad war, but we could use our military for good. And these are the arguments used to undercut McNamara. And you have more conservative, traditionally conservative elements who are actually arguing for a sensible policy of cutting the military budget back and investing in healthcare and education infrastructure. But Clinton promotes these humanitarian intervention. And, he was a very gifted politician. I go into the book. I mean, they recognized from an early age that he had the talent. He could go into Arkansas, even when he was just starting, as a very young guy. He ran for Congress in '74. He was still in his mid-20s, and they said he can go to a town fair and in a rural area and win over the people there. He really had the magic as far as speech making. He was a gifted fundraiser. So he had that ability, and he gave these really flowery speeches. Chapter I think 4 in the book goes into in detail the Balkan conflict and how he sold that to the public, and he got a lot of prominent liberal intellectuals on board, and even the liberal congressmen like Paul Wellstone and Bernie Sanders, who are known as progressives, ended up supporting the bombing of Serbia. And a lot of liberal intellectuals who've been very prominent in the Vietnam War movement supported it. And Clinton was skilled in packaging it as humanitarian intervention. And that set the groundwork for what we've seen in the last 30 years or so. And, some of it was Hillary Clinton, some of it was old Clinton retreats who worked in the Obama administration. And we've seen how the Democratic Party had been, in many ways, more hawkish than the Republicans, or as hawkish at least. And it's the kind of Clintonian rhetoric that they adopt.
Yeah,
And then, of course, there are other issues I go into we can address, like NATO
sure.
expansion and Ukraine. And
Well, let me ask you, we'll absolutely get to that. Let me start in this hemisphere. So, how did Clinton approach Latin America, and how did he extend, if at all, U.S. imperialism in Latin America?
Okay, sure. Yeah, and I should add on the question of historical turning point, the other aspect is he really support this kind of new way of war, a kind of warfare that's reliant on high technology. Like he distances it from the public. He packages this great human rights crusade, but it doesn't have to involve a large commitment of American ground forces or manpower. So that's a way to undercut the dissent, and he's waging war with drone. Like, the Balkan conflict was a kind of turning point as far as this high-tech war with a light American footprint. Uh, but it had a very deadly effect on the population. The bombing killed thousands of people. This war basically, targeted the Serbs who've been trying to keep the Yugoslav Federation together. And they're using private military contractors and supporting, the worst ethnic cleansing was under the Operation Storm carried out by the Croats, and it was basically run by MPRI and all the retired military officers. So that's a kind of new feature of American war. It's a way of distancing the public and undercutting dissent and the reinvigoration of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And we've seen that, of course, expanded in more recent years. As far as Latin America, yeah, he really, well, the other way it was a turning point is he really used the government more so than previous leaders to promote, U.S. Business interests and to promote, free trade agreements and to try and open up economies around the world in a very aggressive way to U.S. corporations. And in many ways, a complete betrayal of liberal or populist economic program of the New Deal era Democrats. And Latin America, yeah, very aggressive. I have a chapter on that where he was just aggressively promoting neoliberal economic policies and supporting leaders like one of his favorites was in Bolivia, Goni. Gonzalo. Now I forget the full name. I know his nickname was Goni. Well, he ended up being tried for a major crime because he privatized the water supply, and then that triggered a mass protest among the indigenous population. And he ultimately cracked down brutally on it and ended up being under indictment for that. But he was a favorite of Clinton. So the leader that were like him that were privatizing, formerly state-run corporations, opening it up to U.S. Exploitation. Those were his favored leaders. and there was ample militarization. That chapter has a discussion of Plan Colombia, was really a very violent counterinsurgency operation. And Joe Biden was a key champion in Congress of that. Um, and this, was basically a counterinsurgency using the war on drugs as a pretext to crack down on the left-wing guerrillas or remnants of them in Colombia and to ramp up U.S. corporate exploitation. And they used, spraying. DynCorp was involved in these spraying operations where they poisoned the lands of peasants. So it's really Vietnam-style operations. In fact, some of the DynCorp pilots or U.S. operatives even came out and said this was just like Vietnam, style counterinsurgency under a different rhetoric. So this is a good example of the hollowness of this rhetoric of humanitarian intervention, the reality of Vietnam-style imperialistic intervention that had terrible effect on local populations.
Nice, nice, excellent. So China is obviously in the news these days. The military-industrial complex is inflating it as a threat to the American public, which many people buy into. How did Clinton reverse Nixon's détente policy towards China, which sort of got us on the path to where we are today?
Yeah, good question. And I think that, Clinton set the groundwork for the Asia pivot. And I think here, the left and the peace movement in the United States needs to really ramp up its activity, because these policies now are very dangerous and threatening a war with China. They're also just contributing to a new arms race in Southeast Asia and very dangerous polarization, reminiscent of, pre-World War II era, some have said. And I think this starts with Clinton. He reversed, he started arming Taiwan. I think a key was his policy toward Taiwan because Nixon and Carter had basically accepted the one China policy and at least acknowledged China's view that Taiwan was a province of China. And I think more had the attitude, well, this is an internal matter because I mean, the United States had support. Chiang Kai-shek was the U.S. boy in the Chinese Civil War, and then the U.S. basically brought him into Taiwan and set him up as the leader there. China had control over Taiwan back starting in the 17th century. Then it was colonized by Japan, but China viewed it as part of part of the Chinese mainland, and that Chiang Kai-shek was an illegitimate usurper that the U.S. had set up there, and the U.S. had set up military, used Taiwan as a base of subversion across Asia throughout the Cold War period. So they had legitimate concerns about that. And I think, Nixon and Carter had a good approach as far as U.S. policy of recognizing China's interest in Taiwan and not wanting to create a conflict over it. But Clinton moved toward where we are today. Now they have this bankrupt porcupine strategy where they want to turn Taiwan into a heavily armed porcupine, allegedly, as defense against threatened Chinese aggression. But from a Chinese point of view, this is a major threat to them, and it's creating it's a source of conflict. So Clinton ramped up that funding of the military. He ramped up arms supplies to Taiwan and started the strategy we see today of turning into heavily armed porcupine, and that creates seeds of conflict with China and create a very tense environment. In fact, China is always going to react, and I think Clinton. I believe some Taiwanese officials came. The Taiwanese leader was allowed to come to the United States and give a kind of anti-China speech, and that was viewed very negatively in China. And they responded by mobilizing some warships. And then Clinton was like Reading, it was like a huge standoff, and there was a threat of war breaking out at that time, a nuclear war. So, the tense environment we see today was started under Clinton. Before that, Carter and Nixon had been backing off and pushing for more peaceful relation and realizing China's interest with Taiwan. So, I think that set the groundwork for a very dangerous situation where we are today. And he
Yeah.
set the groundwork in general for the pivot of demonizing China and a military buildup in Southeast Asia to counter, China's rise. When China is really not a military threat in any way to the United States, what the U.S. fears is simply China's growing economy and supplanting the United States.
Yeah. Well done. Well done. So the other main official enemy, we're told these days, is Russia, of course. So how did Clinton help sort of bring about what we're living in today, which is the new Cold War against Russia, as well?
Yeah, well, there are two, and I have two chapters on Russia, and I think Clinton's Russia policy was an absolute disaster and horror show. Part of it is the shock therapy program and his support for Boris Yeltsin, who was the most corrupt leader in recent Russian history. And he what started under Bush, they sent the Harvard boys to totally restructure the Russian economy from a command, state-run economy to a privatized economy, but they initiated these privatization auctions, and it was done in a very corrupt way that the state-run industries were basically sold for pennies to the dollar to oligarchs who were close to Boris Yeltsin, and some were Westerners or tied with Western elements. And Yeltsin was starting to allow Western corporations to gain access to Russian natural resources. And this was a calamity for Russia because all the state industry it was sold off for pennies to the dollar, so they didn't get enough revenue. I mean, they're giving all their priceless treasures, they're putting into private hand, and they're not getting adequate compensation. The state was basically bankrupt, could not provide public services, and there was, the life quality of life. I think the lifespan declined by 7 years in only a 10-year period or something. It's like unprecedented history, and it's worse than the Depression in the United States. And Yeltsin, yeah, it was just totally corrupt. And Clinton, they helped him win the election in '96. They provided a huge loans to him and money, and they sent advisors and specialists, PR specialists, so he could win that election. So it was a blatant interference in the country. And this, poisoned U.S.-Russian relations. I mean, Russians just and there's a reason why Putin came in and became popular because he was starting to restore some economic sovereignty to the country. Uh, so there was that, as far as just the poisoning of any trust for the United States among Russians. And then there's the key issue of NATO expansion, which most people probably know the story very well, that, H.W. Bush had promised, his administration had promised Gorbachev, NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward, but then Clinton was the one in '98 who allowed for NATO expansion to 3 Eastern European countries, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, I believe. And this, even Yeltsin said that this was, a major threat to Russia. And George Kennan had been. So you have guys like I mean, Clinton is kind of much more hawkish and I guess to the right on foreign policy from figures like Robert McNamara and George Kennan, these ardent cold warriors, and the foes of the peace movement of the '60s, and now they're the good guys in the story because Kennan warned about NATO expansion. He said this will be a disaster. This will be viewed the threat in Russia. It's going to trigger a new Cold War, and that was ignored. And you have, of course, the military industrial complex. There was an organization to lobby for NATO expansion, and it was headed by the vice president of Lockheed Martin. And then there was the ethnic vote. I guess they say that Clinton was trying to court the ethnic vote, Eastern European and emigres who tend to be anti-Russian. It may have been a factor, as well as, of course, the lobbying by military industry. But that just really set the groundwork for this new Cold War that we're seeing. And I do have discussion about Clinton's Ukraine policy because, yeah, he invested a lot. He started the ball rolling of that policy of trying to basically decouple Ukraine from Russia and orient Ukraine to the West. And he was pumping in money for that purpose. And that was viewed as a threat from a Russian point of view. So these kind of policies angered the Russians and created a climate for hostility that has escalated to the point where we are today, where we have a real threat of world war, where the United States is basically directly attacking Russia.
Yeah.
Biden has sanctioned the use of U.S. weapons to be used to attack inside Russia, and they've been attacking the Ukrainians have been attacking Belgorod on the Russian side of the border and killing civilians. And the peace movement should be mobilized against this as well as Israel-Palestine. I find they focus exclusively on Israel-Palestine, when which is terrible, but this is also terrible, and there should be more activism and pushback against these very dangerous policies that
Yeah.
built off what the kind of house that Clinton built.
Horrible house it is.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to take a brief pause right now, and here's why. So Clinton helped. You mentioned what's the horrors that are going on, the slaughter that's going on in Palestine right now. So Clinton helped broker the Oslo Accords. These agreements were signed in 93 and 95. Now, the Oslo Accords helped the Israelis gain much more control over the Palestinians and led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority, which would then control the West Bank on behalf of the Israelis. Now, in the years since Oslo was signed, the Israeli colonists have only increased their presence in the West Bank. Apartheid has been entrenched, and the imprisonment and murder of Palestinians continues unabated. So Oslo did nothing to even address the basic questions like Palestinian refugees or the fact that Israel was established through the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, all this. So the quote-unquote action that we're doing tonight during the webinar is as follows. We will put some links in the chat, and everyone who's watching over Zoom can see if there's a Palestine solidarity protest near you. And you can bring water to it, you can bring food to it, or you can participate in it yourself. So we're going to put some links in there, and I'll do that right now. This is from USCPR, which is a very good website. And there's also, I'm putting in an overall toolkit that anyone out there who's working towards peace can look at and get some ideas from. And we also, additionally, we encourage you, the people who are watching over Zoom, to write in the chat a link or contact information, if you have it, for a group in your area that is taking action in support of Palestine these days. So what we'll do on our end is we'll compile them from the chat, and then in our typical follow-up email that Ken puts together, we'll add those groups for anybody to join or help out in your own way. And so, yeah, we'll just take a couple minutes now, and I'll also mention that if you're looking on the link and there's no local group in your neck of the woods, and there are some other steps you can take in that link. So step 2, for example, in the first link allows you to sign up for alerts regarding Palestine support. Step 3 allows you to call or email your representative of Congress if that's something you're interested in. And step 4 allows you to learn and share information about how much your community's taxes end up going to fuel Israeli apartheid and ultimately genocide. Apartheid in the West Bank, genocide in the Gaza Strip. Yeah, so we'll just take another couple seconds here, see what people are doing. Excellent. Nice. And also, I would say, if you have questions for Jeremy, you can also put those in the chat, and Ken and Brian will keep an eye on those, and we will get to them shortly, because right around about 8:45, we will start fielding your questions as well. Yeah, Ken notes that in Asheville, they're doing weekly bannering for Palestine over an interstate bridge. So that's excellent. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on this, keep an eye on the chat, and please put any information you have there. and we'll get back to it right now. So back to the action, or back from the action to the Jeremy Kuzmarov action. So I more questions for you, Jeremy, but I also wanted to sort of, as we're easing back into it, you are a stellar researcher. You're really, really good at this, and you have, I mean, anybody who's read any of your books is just really, really amazed at how thorough you are and how organized you are. And so I just wanted to ask you if you have advice for anybody out there who's watching right now, who's thinking of getting into research, who's thinking of, writing on their own, who's trying to, get organized on their own end in order to, get their thoughts on paper. If you have any advice for them, yeah, just yeah, let us know. What do you think?
Okay, sure. Well, one advice, and actually, I once posed that question. A researcher I had great respect for, Peter Dale Scott, who's written a lot of books. Probably a lot of people know about him. He's written some great books on some on very covert aspects of U.S. foreign policy, and I think he's a brilliant researcher, a brilliant guy. And I interviewed him for my book, The Myth of the Addicted Army, which was addressing the drug trade in Indochina. So I contacted him about that. And then, at the time I was a graduate student, and I asked him, at Brandeis in the Boston area, and I asked him just what advice he would give to a young researcher. And he gave simple advice: read everything. And so, and yeah, I think you have to read everything, and it could be from a source that, is considered maybe a quack, or, it doesn't really matter the political view. You don't have to agree with their political view, but there may be some good information, even if it's a kind of, somebody who's regarded as a quack, or it could be a right-wing guy, and some of his views may be somewhat quackish, but there may be some good nuggets of information or truth that nobody else is covering. And that's what I found, like in researching Clinton and Obama. I went through a lot of and living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was kind of hotbed of right-wing movements, and Arkansas. But you meet interesting people, and some of these people are pretty knowledgeable. They have local knowledge. They are quite smart about politics, even if ultimately you may not agree with them on certain things. So I think, it's important sometimes to go to those sources, or, take some of these people seriously, because some of the stuff I was describing, like in the early career of Clinton, wasn't very well covered in national media, or, mainstream, or, like mainstream liberal outlets like The Nation, or, they're more alternative, but they're still kind of in a way mainstream. But sometimes you have to go to beyond that to get the truth. And then, yeah, just as much, if there are archives available, it's worth going there. Anything, read as much as you can on the topic. And then, yeah, to organize it is another challenge. But I guess that's one skill I did develop in graduate school, because we had to read so many books for the general exam. So you're good at kind of, like synthesizing or boiling down a whole book, focusing on just the key points in that book. And sometimes the index is your friend, because you don't have time to read a 500-page book, or you're looking for certain things. So use the index, and, try and think of the most important things, and take notes when you're doing the research, so you have it on paper, and then you can come back to it after, and select some of the key material
Excellent.
to use in your chapter or essay. So those would be some key advice I would give.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. And just to add, like, even read mainstream periodicals
Yeah,
that you don't agree with, or that are consistently in support of the empire, like New York Times, Washington Post,
yeah,
because they will have a little
yeah.
nugget somewhere in there towards
They'll
the
have
end that
some
really
truth in
helps
their
out.
articles. Yeah, and read. I think what Scott was saying: read right to left.
Yep.
Everything, and then you can form your own worldview, but you're going to get some good information in a range of sources. And sometimes one side is only focused on one thing, and one side the other thing, so you can get from both. Or yeah, so
Excellent. Excellent. All right, a few more questions from me, and then we're gonna turn it over to the audience. So obviously, the destruction of the Middle East, the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, and before that, the air wars over Iraq, the no-fly zone, the sanctions. Talk to us about how Clinton was sort of a relay runner in Iraq and the wider Middle East. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and this is in general the pattern I've seen in my study of American politics, and I focus, since I'm more a liberal leftist, I focus my research more on liberal left leaders, because they interest me more, and I guess in some ways it angers me more when they totally betray those ideals. But also what I've understood is that there's actually a huge amount of continuity. So whether it's a Republican or Democrat, you often find the same policies from one administration to the next. And even John Kennedy, I find a lot more continuity than discontinuity. It gets at the fact there's something I think structurally at work. And I think peace movement and activists should focus, too often I think they get caught up in partisan politics or play the game of lesser evil, but it's really the structure we need to be challenging, the structure, the military industrial complex. And I.F. Stone said, administration come and go with the Pentagon at the head of the table. And sometimes it's just maybe a slightly different approach or different rhetoric from a Democrat or Republican, but it's basically the same policy. And you see that with Iraq. I mean, obviously the Bushes were more aggressive and more committed to overthrowing Hussein, but Clinton was basically continuing their policy. I mean, you had the first Persian Gulf War, and then Clinton comes in and he initiate these devastating sanctions that Madeleine Albright admitted, contributed to the death of 500,000 children. Was designed to, just destroy their economy, and that would undermine the regime of Saddam Hussein. And then Clinton's administration supported a coup that failed. Scott Ritter called, and Scott Ritter was a great source on Iraq. He wrote a memoir because he was a weapons inspector and he worked in Iraq. And so his memoir covers a long period of Iraq and U.S. Politics in relation with Iraq. And he refers to this failed coup as like the Bay of Pigs. And and the Clinton administration was pouring money into these Shiite opposition groups to Saddam Hussein. And this coup was put down by Hussein, and the culprit, whose name I forget, but it's in the book. He was executed along with his sons. But it was a disastrous coup. And then Clinton was, bombing. So you had sanctions, coup, funding Iraqi opposition, propaganda to try and mobilize world opinion. And he started this alarmism about the weapon of mass destruction. It was his Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, who gave this presentation that Saddam was producing anthrax-grade weapons and this kind of fear-mongering the public. Before there was the Bush and the operation during Iraqi freedom, Clinton was doing the same thing, and that was to build popular support for his bomb. He bombed Iraq quite extensively, especially in the last few years of his presidency, and killed a lot of Iraqis. So, and that sets the groundwork for the full-scale invasion of W. Bush. So it's really huge continuity there. It's a violent policy. And we see that across, the Middle East, like, with Israel, he's ramping up arms supply while he's presenting this kind of humane image and liberal image by brokering the Oslo agreements. But as you said, Oslo was really kind of, well, and Edward Said called it like a Palestinian Versailles because the leader just capitulated, and it gave more of a Palestinian face to the Israeli occupation. And Israel began really ramping up the settlements after, and also arms supplies were being expanded considerably under Clinton to Israel. So he's as hawkish in that as Reagan. Um, and yeah, you can look at other countries in the Middle East. He's promoting regime change in Iran. He's ramping up support to Saudi Arabia and their human rights abuses. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So we got some questions from the chat. Somebody asked about Hillary Clinton. So what's her role? does she align with or diverge from her husband in her own politics? How does sort of, how she fit into the picture?
Well, I think they should be looked at as a team. It's a political team. It was not a real marriage, and that started back in Arkansas. I think little known is the role that Hillary Clinton played in the Iran-Contra affair and the MENA operation, because she was a partner in the Rose Law Firm, and the Rose Law Firm represented many of the big donors to Clinton. And donors who were involved in the MENA armed and drug smuggling, because one of those big donors was named Jackson and Whit, Jackson Stephen. It was two brothers, Jackson and Whit Stevens. They owned Stephen Investment House, is the largest investment house outside of Wall Street. And if you go in Little Rock, even today, you see the name Stephen is on the biggest building. Um, and they own the bank. The Stevens and his investment house owned the major banks in Arkansas, and those banks were being used to launder the money for the Iran-Contra operation that were going on there. And Hillary Clinton provided all the paperwork. She represented her client, Stevens, so she was doing the legal work to help this process. So she was actually very important in the Iran-Contra affair as well. And there are other things that were going on as far like the Whitewater and some corrupt things. They were laundering money in different ways that I go into in those early chapters. So she was, I think there was a lot of corruption going on. But yeah, I think she, I mean, they were out for power, really. I don't know that they had an ideology necessarily. They
Mm,
were just out for, money and power. And they were, hawkish, supporting U.S. imperial operation. And then, we see that when she became Secretary of State. She was known as Hillary the Hawk. And there was a very good article. Yeah, as you say, the mainstream media will often have good articles periodically. There was a very good article in the New York Times Magazine about Hillary Clinton, called, the title was Hillary the Hawk, and it went into all her positions, how she was even more hawkish than the military. And certainly war like Libya had her stamp on it, and that was another Iraq disaster with a horrific humanitarian consequences. And even in Bosnia, she was very hawkish, and I think she like she made these claim that she flew into Bosnia at one point and that she was shot at, and like she wanted to make like she was this hero who survived being shot at by the Serbs, and it was totally made up. So, and I think they saw it maybe as a pathway. They're reading the American public with that they had to present themselves as tough, and that was the way to, and very pro-American and pro-military. That was the way to undercut, conservative attacks on them. So she played up this image, and she was always very hawkish. But
yeah.
she was in league with Clinton. They worked together, I think, as a team.
Yeah, excellent. We also got a question about third parties. So you are as well read as anyone I know on the American political system. If you could just sort of chime in and give your 2 cents, how does someone these days, we're constantly told, we have to vote for the blue team, they're the lesser of two evils. How do we approach third parties? And what are your thoughts coming up on 2024 election, and yeah, also the role of third parties back during when Clinton was running, because I recall Ross Perot was on stage at one point. So talk to us about that, and then fast forward to today and give us your thoughts on today and third parties.
Okay, sure. Well, and yeah, I mean, people ultimately have to make their own choices. I mean, there's some elements of the Democratic platform I still support, would consider much better than the Republican platform. As far as, well, in the 92 race, I do address in the book, because Ross Perot made a big splash in that race. He had kind of a populist economic program. He was criticizing the free trade agreements, and he was also he was pretty critical of U.S. overseas military intervention. Now, he was fixated and obsessed with POWs in Vietnam, and he thought there were still POWs. He was critical of the CIA, so he was an interesting candidate. But there's evidence that the FBI sabotaged Ross Perot's campaign, that they tricked him. And I forget all the detail off the top of my head. It's described in the book. I'd have to refresh my memory exactly how they tricked him, but I know they were involved in trying to undermine his candidacy. And there were elements of the FBI, CIA favoring Clinton over Bush, although Bush also had a CIA background. So it goes to show that these agencies, they do interfere in U.S. politics. Of course, the CIA is not supposed to have any involvement on American soil. It's against its own charter. But there are examples where it violate that we know. So that's one danger. I think Americans aren't always aware how these agencies try and manipulate politics. And then what was I going to say? Well, yeah, well, and that's a pattern in American history, is that the third party, it's so difficult because they always get co-opted. They get infiltrated and co-opted. And I think I was actually reviewing a book on the 19th century in the Gilded Age. It's a brilliant book by Mark Laus, who's a professor at the University of Cincinnati. And it's about a guy named William Carsey, whose job was to disrupt any third parties and the labor movement. Like, he worked for the Democratic Party, and he would infiltrate labor unions and any third party and radical groups, and he would make sure that they would fight each other and that they wouldn't be successful. They were either inefficient, or he would adopt like extreme position to alienate people. And there's so many provocateurs. I know people in the Green Party, and they complain. This woman I know, she's established an offshoot of the Green Party, and it's just a small group now because she feels the Green Party was infiltrated and deliberately made to be inefficient. And some of their positions were rather dubious. Like, they had some really hardcore Ukraine war hawks in the Green Party, and that was another issue. So it seemed very difficult for third parties to have any success. I mean, I think it would be great if they could be made effective, if people in this group would organize a new party. I think that would be great. I mean, I think we need third parties. I mean, I have taught American history. I know that in the Gilded Age, when there are some similar problems to today, and I always tell my students this, we look at the history of the People's Party and the Socialist Party emerge because most people felt then as now that the two-party system was totally corrupt, that the congressmen were all bought off. And in the Gilded Age, they were able to establish, even though there were these saboteurs, the Populist and Socialist Party for a 30-year period, I would say, did have some success. They got people into elected office, whether at the state level, they got mayors, they got members of Congress. They had a big impact in changing the national conversations. They put out newspaper. They helped educate a lot of people. And then the Democrat even recruited William Jennings Bryan to be their candidate. He had been the head of the People's Party, and the Democrat did appropriate elements of the People Party platform in the early 20th century. So those are two examples. I think the party, they overcame the problem and infiltration to have success and to move things from Gilded Age. Progressive era was a much better era of American politics compared to the Gilded Age. So I think projects to revitalize third parties are very important and should be pursued, conscious that there will be infiltrated and attempt to either co-opt or sabotage them, but those could potentially be overcome if there's strength.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, let's wrap this up. I would like to point to the chat right now where Brian Garvey has put a link. He says, don't forget to register for our next one. That's July 18th with Mr. Bruce Gagnon, who knows an enormous amount about NATO and also about space. And so he is going to be talking about NATO as an aggressive, destabilizing danger to the world. So please register. The link is right there. And I just wanted to say thank you to you all. Thank you to Brian for doing the tech work. Thank you for Ken for being just the legend that you are, and for also working behind the scenes tonight. And thank you, Jeremy. You are an absolute champion. We are so grateful for your presence here tonight. Thank you for educating us. And yeah, best of